It started with a door. A simple thing, really. Just a piece of wood that should have been shut tight against the Montana wind. Yet that morning, when Raymond returned from the market, he saw it standing open by an inch. Not wide, not dramatic, just ajar enough to make the breath catch in his throat. In the quiet of early winter, when the forest holds its breath and the cold carries sound farther than it should, even an open door can feel like a warning, or the beginning of an unforgettable story. He stood still on the porch for a moment, listening. Wind brushed through the pines. Somewhere in the valley, a crow called out, with the kind of voice that makes a man think twice. Raymond rested his hand on the frame, steadying himself. It had been years since he'd felt that old alertness. The way he used to scan the forest back when he served as a ranger. He hadn't needed that part of himself lately, not since the cabin had grown quiet after Margaret passed. But the quiet wasn't empty today. It felt watchful. Raymond pushed the door open, slowly, carefully. The kind of careful that comes from miles of trailing injured elk and reading signs in the snow. The kind of careful man forgets, until something reminds him. Inside, the scene looked like mischief had blown through on purpose. A chair cushion lay on the floor, flattened like someone had tried to wrestle it. A throw blanket hung halfway off the couch, tangled in its own yarn. A ceramic mug he'd brought back from Yellowstone years ago sat in pieces near the wood stove. A thin line of flour, he still didn't understand this part, trailed across the floor like someone had walked through the kitchen with absolutely no respect for boundaries. And there, right in the center of the chaos, was a shape, small, spotted, and unmistakably still. A bobcat. Not moving, not breathing, at least not from where he stood. Stretched out in a dramatic pose so perfect it almost looked staged. Sable. You didn't know her name yet, not officially, but this was their first true meeting, and if first impressions mattered, this one was determined to leave a mark. Raymond froze. A wild animal in his cabin wasn't something he took lightly. On instinct, his hand moved to his jacket pocket, where he kept a small folding knife, not for confrontation, just for reassurance. But even reassurance felt thin in that moment. A bobcat inside a home can be unpredictable, even dangerous. And if she were injured, or preparing to defend herself? He stepped closer, one quiet footfall at a time. His nerves pulled tight. Then, without warning, the lifeless bobcat sprang up with a snap of energy that jolted the air. She shook her head as if waking from a light nap, stretched her legs with theatrical grace, and looked at him with the insulted dignity of a performer who realizes she wasn't properly applauded. A single blink, slow and deliberate. Then she hopped onto the windowsill with a lightness that made the entire scene feel like a scene from one of those heartwarming stories people share when they want to feel hopeful. Raymond let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Well," he murmured, "you gave me a scare there." The bobcat, later to be known as Sable, didn't seem the least bit concerned. She simply began cleaning a forepaw, as though the room wasn't in shambles, and she hadn't just staged a performance worthy of an Oscar. If loyalty had a feline expression, hers seemed to say, "I'm here, and I'll stay if I choose." This was the beginning of what would become an inspirational story, one built on unexpected company and the kind of gentle companionship a lonely heart learns to treasure. For now, though, all Raymond could do was take in the evidence of her dramatic arrival. A streak of pillow stuffing clung to her whiskers. A tuft of faux fur lay stuck to her shoulder. She carried herself in a way that felt strangely regal. Regal and profoundly unapologetic. Her presence filled the cabin, and something in him stirred. An old, quiet place that remembered what it was like to care. He wasn't used to that feeling anymore, not since losing Margaret. Loneliness has a way of settling into the rafters, into the floorboards, into a man's chest. He'd learned to live with it, learned to ignore its weight. But now, with this dramatic creature perched near the window like she owned every beam of sunlight, loneliness felt suddenly interrupted, and that was new. As he wiped up the broken pottery, he noticed how her eyes tracked his movements, curious but calm, not fearful. That calmness said more than words ever could. A wild animal doesn't relax unless it senses something safe, something steady, something like kindness, maybe love, maybe loyalty in a language he hadn't spoken in a long time. He studied her cautiously. She returned the look with a slow blink. Experts say that's a bobcat's version of trust, a way of saying, "You're allowed to exist here." And while Raymond knew better than to interpret too much into animal behavior, there was something soulful in her gaze, something that felt almost like gratitude, almost like she had chosen him. He crouched down, elbows resting gently on his knees, giving her plenty of space. "If you're going to stay," he whispered, "you'll need to understand that I'm not as young as I used to be. Try not to give me a heart attack next time you audition for whatever show you're putting on." Her ear twitched, a tiny acknowledgement. It made him smile, a soft, surprised smile that lifted the corners of his mouth in a way they hadn't lifted in months. Happiness can be quiet. It can be small. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a wild bobcat testing her boundaries in a warm cabin on a cold day. As he swept the last bits of flour, he recalled a moment years earlier with Margaret. She used to bake bread on Saturdays, dusting the kitchen in the same way Sable had done now, except Margaret had been much more apologetic afterward. He remembered how he'd told her the mess didn't matter. "What matters," he'd said, "is that the house feels lived in." Looking at Sable now, he felt that memory settle in gently. The house felt lived in again. That realization made his throat tighten. There's a certain tenderness in discovering you're still capable of caring. It arrives quietly, rarely with fanfare, and sometimes it takes a creature with spotted fur and a flair for drama to remind you that life still holds surprises worth staying awake for. Some people believe only pets can form bonds with humans, but wild animals have their own ways, subtle, deliberate, honest. Their trust isn't given, it's earned, and when it comes, it carries a purity that feels like a gift. Not ownership, not possession, just a crossing of paths that changes both sides. Raymond didn't know all that yet, but he felt something shift inside him as Sable settled comfortably in the windowsill, her tail curling neatly around herself. Something warm, something patient. A beginning. If you've ever had an animal choose you before you understood why, you'll recognize this feeling. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because this was only the first act in Sable's long-running play. And the real performance, filled with laughter, lessons, and a few surprising truths, was just about to begin, leading us into part 2, A Queen in the Cabin. Sable's theatrics begin. There's a moment, shortly after any unexpected guest arrives, when you learn who you're dealing with. For Raymond, that moment came the morning he realized the bobcat now sharing his cabin wasn't just a visitor. She was a queen, auditioning for the role of ruler of the household, and every room was her stage. Sable didn't creep around like a timid creature testing boundaries. She walked with the quiet certainty of someone who fully believed the cabin had been built for her comfort. She surveyed the place the way people look at a hotel room they've already decided deserves a 3-star review. With every step she took, Raymond noticed something that felt almost intentional. Her slow pacing. The way she paused at each object. The evaluating tilt of her head. It wasn't arrogance. It was a theater. She moved as if narrating a story only she could hear. Raymond sat in his chair by the small kitchen table, half amused, half concerned. The early winter light filtered through the frosted windows, turning the dust motes into soft gold. Sable stepped into that beam, her coat catching the light, her posture tall and unhurried. She glanced at him, one long, lingering look, and then let out a slow, exaggerated yawn that lasted far longer than seemed necessary. He blinked. She blinked back. The yawn stretched on. That was the moment he understood she wasn't just dramatic. She had range. Animals, especially solitary ones like bobcats, use body language the way people use entire paragraphs. A yawn isn't always about tiredness. It can be communication, a form of reassurance, or a quiet assertion of presence. And Sable had a way of doing it that made the gesture feel almost expressive. Like she was saying, "I am observing you, and I am also letting you know I'm perfectly comfortable right where I am." Experts note that bobcats rely heavily on visual cues, subtle shifts in posture, and expression that other animals read instinctively. To an untrained human eye, it might look like sass or melodrama, but to the bobcat, it's just conversation. Sable, however, carried that conversation with a flair that would have made any theater director proud. One morning, only a few days after her first performance on the floor, Raymond woke to a soft thump in the living room. At first, he thought it was a log shifting in the wood stove. But then came another thump, more pointed this time. When he walked in, he found Sable perched on the back of the couch, staring at the small bookshelf near the wall. Without breaking eye contact, she extended one paw and tapped the first book. It fell to the floor. Another tap, second book down. Then she looked at him. Not guilty, not apologetic, just something like, "I hope you're paying attention." He raised an eyebrow. She tapped the third book. Raymond sighed. Not in frustration, but in the kind of disbelief that warms into laughter. "All right," he said, "breakfast is coming." And she stopped, sat down, tie neatly wrapped, a perfect picture of royal patience. That little display became part of their routine, a small reminder each morning that she expected him to keep up. Not because she was demanding, but because in her own quiet bobcat way, she had begun trusting him to understand her rhythms. Those early days felt like leafing through a heartwarming story, one written slowly, with pauses for tenderness and moments of humor. Ray found himself anticipating her signals, watching the way she tilted her head before making a decision, the way her ears angled toward him even when she pretended not to notice him entering the room. There was something soulful in those gestures, something that reached deeper than simple survival. A house changes when a presence fills it, not just physically, but emotionally. The cabin had been still for so long that Raymond had grown used to the quiet. But Sable brought a different kind of quiet. Not empty, not hollow. A living, breathing quiet that held warmth and possibility. He felt that warmth seeping into places inside him he hadn't opened in years. It reminded him of how Margaret used to move through the cabin, humming gently under her breath as she brewed morning coffee or folded quilts. She wasn't loud either, just steady, just present. Sable didn't replace that, of course, but she stirred echoes of it. The comfort of having another being sharing your space, altering the way light lands on a moment. Some evenings, Sable would sit near his feet while he read, not touching him, not seeking affection like a domestic cat might. Instead, she chose a spot where she could be part of the room's energy. She'd let out a short, raspy chirp every so often, and Raymond learned it meant she was content. It was a sound that nudged something open in him, a reminder that connection doesn't always come wrapped in the familiar shape of human companionship. Sometimes it arrives wearing spots and whiskers, with loyalty expressed through presence rather than touch. When people think of wildlife, they often imagine untouchable things, creatures meant to stay in forests, unreachable, unknowable. But Sable offered a different truth. Old animals can carry a kind of honesty that makes you reconsider your assumptions. They're not fairy tales, not symbols, not props in moral stories. They're living beings with emotions, instincts, and their own quiet forms of communication. Sable's theatrics weren't a call for attention. They were her way of existing, her way of bridging the space between species without losing her nature. Raymond found comfort in that balance. She wasn't pretending to be something she wasn't. She was simply showing him how she moved through the world and trusting him to watch with clarity. As the days passed, her presence became a kind of companionship he hadn't known he needed. Not the loud kind, not the demanding kind, just a steady, soulful reminder that life still offers unpredictable forms of love. But Sable wasn't just dramatic inside the cabin. Her theatrics became even more striking when the world outside shifted, when winter deepened and the forest grew quiet in its own way. What happened next would teach Raymond more about fear, trust, and the changing seasons than he'd learned in years. leading him toward a moment that would stay with him forever. If you've ever shared space with an animal who seemed to understand more than it should, you'll want to stay for what comes next. If autumn teaches a man to let go, winter teaches him to look inward. And in the long Montana winter that settled across the valley that year, Raymond learned to see his own grief reflected in the snow, and how a bobcat's quiet company can thaw places he thought were frozen for good. The cold deepened day by day. Snow gathered in soft drifts against the cabin walls. The sky, pale and endless, stretched like a sheet pulled tightly across the horizon. Everything slowed. The forest grew still enough that even the creek behind the house moved with hesitation, as if unsure whether it should keep flowing or surrender to ice. Inside the cabin, the air carried its own kind of hush. Not empty, just thoughtful. Sable took to watching the snowfall from the windowsill, her ears twitching at each soft thud of snow sliding from the roof. She didn't seek Raymond's attention, and she didn't demand anything. Instead, she settled into the rhythm of the cabin as if she'd always been meant to fill its open spaces. There was something deeply soulful in the way she existed. Quiet, observant, present. Wild animals aren't known for long displays of affection, but they do understand presence. Bobcats communicate safety not through touch, but through proximity. If a bobcat chooses to sit near you, it's not an accident. It's a sign that you've passed an invisible test, one built not on words, but on patience, energy, and trust. And Sable chose her spots with intention. Most mornings, Raymond would wake to find her lying not far from his rocking chair, her body curled into a neat circle, tail tucked gently over her paws, not touching him, but close enough that he felt her there before he even opened his eyes. It was a small thing, but small things become important in winter. Raymond had spent the past few years adjusting to an emptier kind of cold. After Margaret died, the silence of the cabin had grown heavy, settling in the same way snow collects on branches, quietly, one layer at a time, until even strong limbs sag. He filled that silence with small distractions. An old radio murmuring in the background, half-finished crossword puzzles, the sound of the wind rattling the eaves, but none of it reached the deeper ache. Sable didn't fix that ache either. She wasn't a replacement for anything. She was simply here, a living presence that changed the texture of the silence. Her weight on the floorboards, her breath is soft and steady. Her eyes reflected firelight at dusk. These things didn't erase grief, but they shifted how it lived inside him. One evening in late December, Raymond stood at the stove stirring a pot of chicken and barley soup. Outside, the wind blew with the low moan of a winter storm, and the cabin felt tucked into the world like a secret. He'd left the radio off, not intentionally, just because he didn't feel the need to fill the air. Sable sat at the far end of the room, her gaze fixed on him. She wasn't waiting for food. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just watching, her tail curled loosely around her paws, blinking every so often as if confirming that everything was as it should be. He paused, wooden spoon in hand. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how much a little company can change the feeling of a room." Sable didn't move, but her ears shifted toward his voice, acknowledging the sound the way wild things do, gently, attentively. Raymond felt something soften in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but something close. Something like warmth moving through a place that had been cold for too long. Loneliness is a patient visitor. It settles in without knocking, and it doesn't leave just because you wish it gone. Grief is even more stubborn. It curls into the corners of a life and stays there, becoming part of the architecture. A man who's loved deeply learns that grief doesn't shrink, it just changes shape over time. But companionship, unexpected, quiet companionship, can create new corners where light gathers again. As Raymond watched Sable blink slowly at him, he realized how long it had been since another living being had shared his routine. Not interfering, not demanding, just sharing the space. And that small act carried more kindness than he'd known how to ask for. He thought of Margaret then, as he often did during winter. She used to say that love wasn't always about what was said. Sometimes love was the way a person set down a cup gently, or how they folded your favorite sweater at the end of laundry day, or how they sat beside you without needing conversation. Sable, in her own way, was teaching him that lesson again. People often imagine companionship as something loud, shared laughter, busy days, noise that fills a home. But sometimes what a person needs most is the opposite: a steady presence, a gentle rhythm, a reminder that life continues even in silence. Animals understand this better than we do. A bobcat doesn't offer comfort through words or hugs. She offers it through stillness, through the quiet act of choosing to remain close. That choice carries its own kind of loyalty, its own quiet form of love. It doesn't feel like a grand gesture, but it settles deep. Raymond didn't notice the shift all at once. It grew slowly, like fire catching on a stubborn log. But one evening, as he read by the wood stove, he realized the loneliness that used to fill the entire room had shrunk to just a few corners, and he found himself breathing easier. One morning after a heavy snowfall, Raymond found Sable waiting near the door at dawn. The world outside was a sheet of untouched white. Trees bowed under the weight of the night storm. The sun had barely risen, just enough to give the sky a faint lavender glow. When he stepped onto the porch, she followed him. Not close behind, just a few feet back, matching his pace, her paws leaving neat impressions in the snow. Together they stood side by side, watching the valley wake. Raymond didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something in him understood. Grief and winter were not enemies. They were mirrors. And what he saw that morning was the beginning of a thaw. But winter can change its tone without warning. And just when Raymond was learning to trust these small rituals, the season shifted in a way that would test every old instinct he had kept buried. Sable, ever the quiet queen of the cabin, was about to vanish into that white wilderness. And what happened next would reveal more about fear, loyalty, and love than he ever expected. If you've ever known the sharp edge of winter or the soft comfort of unexpected companionship, stay with me. The story deepens from here. There are storms you see coming, and storms that arrive before you understand how unprepared you are. The morning Sable vanished. The wind had a way of swallowing sound. The sky pressed low, and the cold felt sharper than usual, as if the world itself had taken a breath and held it. Raymond woke to a strange stillness. The cabin was darker than it should have been, dim, even with the fire banked low in the stove. Snow had piled against the windows in the night, muting the light and creating that muffled, quiet winter storms always bring. He sat up slowly, listening for the familiar soft movements, the faint thump of Sable landing from the windowsill, the rustle of her tail brushing against the wood floor, the tiny chirp she used when she stretched. Nothing. He waited a moment longer, listening harder. Still nothing. A small uneasiness found its way into his chest. Not panic, not yet, but a kind of alertness that tugged at an old instinct he hadn't relied on since his ranger days. He rose, pulled on a thick sweater, and stepped into the main room. Sable's usual spot near the fireplace was empty. The blanket on the couch remained undisturbed. The bowl of water still held a thin sheet of ice on top, a sign she hadn't touched it since before the storm rolled in. The cabin didn't just feel quiet. It felt vacant in a way that made his breath thin. He walked to the back door and noticed the latch wasn't fully engaged. Only a sliver open, barely noticeable, but enough. He knew she could nudge it with her shoulder if she wanted to. Clever animals often learn faster than people expect. He had seen that spark in Sable, intelligent, determined, independent. But this storm, it wasn't something any creature should be wandering in. He pushed open the door, and the wind greeted him with a blast that cut straight through the layers of his clothing. Snow swirled so thick it blurred the tree line, erasing the world into a wash of white. It was the kind of cold that steals warmth from a man's bones. When storms hit the northern Rockies, Animals behave unpredictably.
Bobcats, though solitary and capable hunters, can become disoriented by shifting scents, deep drifts, and the raw force of winter.
Sometimes they roam out of instinct. Sometimes they venture too far, chasing sound or movement hidden in the wind. And sometimes, when a creature feels the pressure of approaching weather, it moves, simply because something ancient inside it says, go.
But for a bobcat still learning the edges of a human home, a storm like this could be confusing, dangerous even. Raymond knew that, and the idea of her out there alone pulled at him with a heaviness he couldn't ignore. He stepped onto the porch, scanning the snow. After a moment, he found them. Prints. Neat, round, purposeful. Sable's tracks. They moved away from the cabin, weaving between the pines that bordered the clearing, and without thinking much at all, Raymond followed. He moved through the storm with the cautious confidence of someone who had once tracked lost hikers through mountain passes. His boots sank deep into the snow with each step. The cold burned at his cheeks. But he stayed focused, watching the ground, reading the marks she left behind. The first set of paw prints looked clear, almost bold. She had moved quickly at the beginning. Maybe she hadn't realized how harsh the storm would become. But as Raymond continued, he noticed the prints began to stagger slightly. A slip here, a deeper plunge there, a sign that the wind had worsened, that the drifts were shifting under her weight. He called her name into the storm, but his voice was swallowed immediately. He tried again, louder. Still nothing. For a moment, the panic he had been holding back pressed hard against his ribs. He kept going. The tracks led him toward a small outcropping where the forest dipped into a shallow ravine. The snow was deeper there. Twice he stumbled. Once he had to brace himself against a fallen tree. But he didn't stop. He remembered searching for an injured elk once, years ago, after a late-season storm. Margaret had been by his side then, smiling through chattering teeth, telling him that worry was the clearest sign of love. You don't worry unless something matters. The memory tightened in his throat as he followed Sable's fading trail. Eventually, the prints disappeared altogether. The storm had swept over them, burying the signs, erasing direction. Raymond stood still, heart pounding, hands shaking inside his gloves. He turned in a slow circle, searching, listening, hoping for anything, a sound, a shadow, a movement in the white. But the world was silent. It was then he felt the weight of loneliness press against him again. The kind he thought Sable had carried away in the weeks since she arrived. The kind he had convinced himself he no longer needed to contend with. He whispered into the snow, "Where did you go, girl?" It's strange, the way fear reveals what someone truly means to you. Raymond had known Sable for only a short time, and yet her absence felt like a missing piece of his own breath. Grief has a way of teaching a heart to brace itself, to avoid caring too quickly. But love, any kind of love, still finds a way to surface when you least expect it. He had been so careful since Margaret's passing, guarding himself from loss by keeping the world small. And here he was, chest aching, searching through a storm for a bobcat who had chosen his quiet cabin as her stage. It humbled him. It softened him. It reminded him that caring, even when it hurts, is part of being alive. People often underestimate how deeply animals can weave themselves into our days, not through human-like affection, but through presence, through routine, through the steady, silent company that asks nothing but teaches everything: kindness, patience, loyalty, and the beauty of simply being there. Raymond wasn't searching just because he was worried. He was searching because Sable had opened something in him, a door he didn't realize he'd closed. By the time he trudged back toward the cabin, exhausted, hands numb, breath ragged, he felt both defeated and changed. He stepped up onto the porch, pushing the door open with a heaviness that sank deeper than the cold. And then he froze, because there she was. Sable lay curled near the fire, her coat still damp, her breathing steady. She lifted her head when he entered, her eyes meeting his with a look so steady, so knowing, that it weakened his knees. It was as if she were asking,
"Where did you go?" "I came home." A breath escaped him, half relief, half disbelief. He knelt beside her, careful but overwhelmed. "I was looking for you," he whispered, voice cracking with emotions he didn't bother to hide. "I thought I'd lost you." Sable blinked slowly. Once, twice. A gesture that felt like acceptance. She wasn't performing now. She wasn't playing a role. She was simply present. And in that presence, Raymond felt something warm rise through him. Hope, gratitude, maybe even happiness. He fetched towels, gently drying her fur. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. She let him tend to her with a calmness that felt like trust blooming in real time. Snow still battered the cabin walls outside, but inside, the warmth deepened. And just when Raymond thought the storm had given him all the lessons it had to offer, the next chapter in this unlikely companionship would push him toward a crossroads. One involving officials, ethics, and the delicate boundary between wildness and home. If you've ever felt the fierce pull of worry for a creature who stole your heart without meaning to, stay with me. The story is about to take a turn. There are moments when the world outside your door arrives without warning, asking questions you were not ready to consider. For Raymond, that moment came on a bright, brittle morning when two wildlife officers stepped out of a government truck, their breath rising in pale clouds, ready to discuss the bobcat who had quietly rearranged the meaning of his days. The knock came just after sunrise. It startled him, not because it was loud, but because so few people ever made the drive up that long gravel road. Sable, resting near the fire, lifted her head, not alarmed, but alert. She seemed to understand that the sound wasn't part of their usual routine. Raymond opened the door to find two officers, a man and a woman, bundled in thick winter gear, standing politely on the porch. Their expressions were professional but not unkind, shaped by the kind of work that requires equal measures of firmness and empathy. "Morning," the woman said. "We're with Montana Wildlife Services. Mind if we come in?" He hesitated, not out of distrust, but out of an instinct to protect the fragile peace inside the cabin. Still, he stepped aside. Sable didn't move from her spot, though her ears angled toward the newcomers, tracking every subtle shift. The officers glanced around the room, not critically, but with an unmistakable awareness. They saw the bobcat on the rug. They saw the water bowl near the stove. They saw a home that wasn't just shelter, it was shared space. And that was the very reason they were here. In states like Montana, wild animals cannot be kept in a residence without proper permits. Even temporary companionship, if misunderstood, can lead to complications. A bobcat, accustomed to humans, may lose the instincts it needs to survive in the wild. And a human, accustomed to caring for a wild animal, may blur lines without meaning to. The officers weren't here to accuse. They were here to assess. The male officer crouched, gently, observing Sable without approaching. "She doesn't seem frightened of us," he said. "No," Raymond replied quietly. "She came in on her own, and she stayed." The woman jotted something on a clipboard. "We've had reports from neighbors," she explained. "Just sightings, mostly. A bobcat is lingering near porches. Nothing aggressive, but enough to warrant a check-in." Raymond nodded. He felt a weight settling in his chest, not fear, something closer to the ache of being asked to justify something you love without having the words for it. Sable watched the officers with a regal calm, as if evaluating them in return. No hissing, no retreat, just a steady, golden gaze that seemed almost discerning. The woman noticed. "That's unusual," she murmured. "Wild bobcats don't typically behave like this unless they've bonded." Raymond told them about the early morning she appeared, relaxed and unafraid. About her dramatic flourishes, her yawns, her slow blinks, the theatrical poses she adopted as though each day required a fresh performance. He told them about the blizzard, the search, and the moment she had returned to the cabin drenched in snow, settling near the fire as if coming home. The officers exchanged a look, not judgmental, but thoughtful. "You understand," the male officer said carefully. She can't be treated like a pet.
A bobcat is still wild, no matter how gentle she appears.
I know, Raymond said softly. I haven't asked anything of her. She just lives here. He didn't add the part that mattered most, that in living here, she'd brought warmth back into the quiet corners of his grief.
The woman stepped forward, keeping her tone gentle.
Sir, do you have experience in wildlife care? Past training? Anything that would give you the foundation for safely housing a non-releasable animal? He hesitated again, but this time for a different reason. I worked as a ranger for 30 years, he said. I know the rules.
And I know what it means for an animal to lose its fear of humans.
Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That helps. That helps a lot. There are truths a person speaks without intending to reveal the deeper layers beneath them. When Raymond said he knew what it meant for an animal to lose its fear, what he didn't say was that he knew what it meant for a human to lose theirs. After Margaret passed, he had built a life shaped by avoidance, avoiding connection, avoiding risk, avoiding anything that might leave a mark. And then Sable arrived, fearless, unapologetic, present. She had walked into his quiet winter like a small storm of possibility. To think that someone, anyone, might take her away, pressed against him like the cold outside. Not because he wanted to own her, but because he wanted to protect the fragile trust she had given him. Wildlife officers carry a difficult responsibility. They must bridge the space between legal requirements, public safety, and compassion for both humans and animals. They see complicated situations, injured foxes sheltering under barns, orphaned fawns curled on porches, coyotes approaching backyards they shouldn't. To them, Sable wasn't just a heartwarming story. She was a case, an example of an animal who might not survive release due to her lack of fear. That reality held weight. The woman lowered her clipboard slightly. Here's the truth, she said. Sable isn't safe to return to the wild. She may approach the wrong property or the wrong person. Someone might harm her out of fear. Raymond felt a jolt of protective instinct. We're not here to remove her, she continued, but we need to make sure she's housed legally and safely. If you're willing, you could apply for rehabilitation permits. With oversight, proper enclosures, and veterinary support, she could stay. Sable rose from her spot then, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. She walked directly toward Raymond and sat beside him, not touching, but aligned. A quiet gesture, a declaration in her language of where she belonged. The male officer noticed and softened. She chose you, he said quietly. That matters. Raymond felt emotions rise, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady and sure. He nodded. Tell me what I need to do. The officers explained the steps. Paperwork, a formal application, inspections, building a proper enclosure connected to the cabin, and veterinary evaluations. It was no small undertaking, but Raymond listened closely, committing each detail to memory. Sable sat through the entire discussion without a hint of distress, as though she understood her fate was being shaped in that room. When the officers finally stepped back onto the porch, she followed them to the doorway and watched them leave with the same quiet confidence she'd shown from the start. Raymond stood beside her. She's staying, he whispered. Sable blinked slowly, and so began a new chapter, one that required effort, patience, and a kind of renewed purpose Raymond hadn't felt in years. Building an enclosure, working with a veterinarian, shaping a space that honored both wildness and safety. It would lead him to yet another discovery, one he didn't expect. Because just when he thought his cabin had room for only one extraordinary bobcat, the forest had other plans. If you've ever taken a risk on something fragile, or fought to protect a bond that felt meant to be, stay with me. Something new is about to enter the story. Some seasons slip in quietly, almost unnoticed. Others arrive with a kind of soft insistence, reminding you that nothing in nature stays frozen forever. That spring, as the snow retreated from the pines and the creek behind the cabin found its voice again, Raymond discovered that thawing wasn't just something the earth did. it was something the heart did too. And that thaw would lead to a quiet arrival he never saw coming. Winter's grip loosened slowly. Patches of brown earth peeked through the melting snow. Tiny buds appeared on the birch branches, wearing the palest green, like the world was rehearsing color before bringing it all the way back. The air still had a chill, but the harshness had softened. Even the wind seemed to blow with gentler intention. Inside the cabin, Sable began spending more time perched on the back of the couch, watching the forest, as though she could feel spring waking up. Raymond noticed it too, her tail twitching with a touch more curiosity, her ears swiveling at every bird call, her posture alert but relaxed. It was the season of movement, and she felt it in her bones. And Raymond felt something in himself, a renewed purpose. The wildlife officers had set the guidelines clearly. If Sable were to remain legally and safely under his care, she needed an enclosure, a space that reflected her wild nature even as she shared his home. So he began building. Wildlife enclosures for animals like bobcats require more than fencing. They must offer space to climb, hide, leap, perch, and explore. They must mimic a small slice of the landscape the animal would have claimed in the wild. It's a balance. Safety without captivity, freedom without risk, loyalty without ownership. Raymond took this responsibility seriously, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. He spent early mornings sketching plans on the kitchen table, the sunlight just brushing the pages. He spent afternoons hauling lumber, shaping beams, and measuring the ground with care. Every nail he hammered felt like a promise he was keeping, not to the officers, but to Sable herself. She watched him through the window, occasionally chirping her approval in that raspy little voice she used when she was both curious and amused. One afternoon, as Raymond anchored the final support post, Sable stepped outside with him for the first time since the storm. She walked gingerly across the damp ground, testing the earth with delicate paws. The enclosure stood before her. Tall mesh walls, natural logs arranged like a small woodland playground, a slanted roof section for shelter, and a shallow stream running through a corner where water reflected the sunlight in broken, shimmering patterns. She circled it once, then again. Raymond stood silently, hands resting on his hips, giving her space to explore. Sable paused by a large climbing log, sniffing it, inspecting each groove as if evaluating his craftsmanship. Then she looked back at him with a slow blink, an acknowledgement, a gesture almost regal. And then, with quiet dignity, she walked back inside the cabin. Raymond let out a breath that turned into a soft laugh. "All that work," he said, smiling at nothing in particular. "And you still prefer the couch." But it wasn't disappointment. It was something gentler, an understanding that wildness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it chooses comfort. Sometimes it chooses a connection. Sometimes it simply appreciates effort, even if it doesn't use it in the way you expect. The enclosure wasn't for show. It was for the possibility. And possibility often blooms where patience is present. Spring has a way of stirring memory. As Raymond worked each day, he found himself thinking of Margaret. How she once dreamed of tending a vegetable garden outside the cabin. How she talked about giving wildlife a place of safety during harsh seasons. He remembered her saying that kindness wasn't always something people saw. Sometimes it was the unseen work you did quietly, simply because it was right. Building that enclosure felt like honoring her in a way he hadn't realized he still needed. Sable, in her own mysterious wisdom, had led him back to that part of himself. People often imagine that caring for a wild animal is dramatic, full of constant challenges or extraordinary moments. But more often, it's made of ordinary actions. Steady, respectful routines. Choices made from love rather than impulse. The humility of knowing the animal doesn't belong to you, but still choosing to care anyway. Those small acts, the hammering, the measuring, the planning, were the quiet edges of loyalty. Not the kind we see in fairy tales, but the kind that grows from the inside out. And it was during one of those ordinary evenings when the cabin smelled of sawdust and melting snow that something unexpected happened. Raymond was washing his hands at the kitchen sink when he heard a strange sound, a soft scrape at the door, not unlike the way Sable sometimes scratched when she wanted to announce her presence. But Sable was right behind him, stretched out on the rug, eyes half closed. Both of them turned toward the door at the same time. The scratch came again.
This one is sharper.
Raymond wiped his hands on a towel and walked to the door slowly, a familiar caution rising in his chest. He opened it just enough to look outside, and first all he saw was twilight settling over the clearing. Then he looked down. There, shivering in the fading light, was a young bobcat, thin, trembling,
Ribs showing under patchy fur, one ear torn, not fresh but not healed either. Eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperation, and standing right behind the young stranger, calm, composed, protective, was Sable. Raymond froze for a moment, emotions rising in a rush. Sable stepped forward just slightly, positioning herself between him and the smaller bobcat, her posture steady but not aggressive. She let out a single, quiet chirp. One Raymond had learned meant reassurance. It was as if she were saying, "This one needs help. Let him in." Raymond's voice softened instinctively. "All right," he whispered. "Okay, come inside." The younger bobcat hesitated, paws trembling on the porch. He moved in slow, jerky steps, the way creatures do when life has taught them to expect pain at every corner. Sable walked beside him, guiding, not pushing. Inside, she led him straight to the water bowl. Raymond watched with a lump in his throat as the newcomer drank, shaking with both cold and exhaustion. A name formed in his mind without effort. Indigo, for the faint bluish tint the twilight cast across his small, fragile frame. Some arrivals don't come with drama or theatrics. They come quietly, on weak legs, carrying stories of hardship that will never be fully told. Indigo didn't need words. His body and Sable, once a dramatic queen of the cabin, stepped into a role Raymond hadn't anticipated. Guardian. The loyalty in that moment was unmistakable. It reminded Raymond that love often shows itself through protection, not possession. Through kindness, offered long before trust is returned. People assume wild animals exist only in competition with one another. But here was something different. A lesson in empathy, woven through instincts. A reminder that compassion isn't limited by species. Sable had once walked into this cabin seeking comfort, warmth, and perhaps a bit of companionship. Now, Raymond knelt near Indigo, giving him space, but offering something human hearts are built to give. Reassurance. He glanced at Sable, who watched over the younger bobcat with a confidence and tenderness he hadn't seen before. This was no longer just a story about him and Sable. It was becoming something larger. A small, unexpected family shaping itself quietly in a cabin at the edge of the Montana woods. And as Indigo's trembling eased, Raymond realized a new chapter was beginning. One filled with healing, slow trust, and lessons he never imagined learning. If you've ever witnessed how kindness can ripple outward, one heart healing another, stay with me. The next part reveals how trust grows inside a home that wasn't expecting any of this. Some seasons teach through hardship, others through quiet miracles. That spring, as the light grew warmer and the forest shook off its last traces of winter, Ray learned that healing doesn't always begin with grand gestures. It often begins with three hearts learning how to share the same gentle rhythm. Indigo's arrival reshaped the cabin almost overnight. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, meaningful ones. His steps were timid, each movement calculated. He watched Raymond from behind furniture, from the shadowed corners of the room, from wherever he felt the safest. He seemed to exist in the delicate space between wanting to trust and being afraid to try. Sable understood this better than any human could. She stayed close to him, not smothering, not demanding, simply present. She groomed his ear when he trembled. She curled around him when he shivered in sleep. She guided him to food with slow, patient nudges. In her presence, Indigo softened, little by little. Old animals recovering from trauma follow a natural arc: survival, stabilization, and eventually, cautious curiosity. Survival is instinctive: eat, rest, hide. Stabilization is quiet, observing, assessing, learning what is safe. Curiosity marks the turning point, stepping forward instead of back, exploring instead of retreating. Raymond watched these stages unfold with a sense of reverence, as if witnessing a kind of soulful choreography between two bobcats, one wounded, one wise. At first, Indigo stayed behind the couch, wedged between the backrest and the wall where the shadows were deep. Sable visited him throughout the day, lying nearby with a stillness that seemed to say, "Take what time you need." Animals know how to give space in ways humans sometimes forget. Raymond respected that rhythm. He made no sudden movements, kept his voice low, and moved through the cabin with care. Part of it came from his ranger instincts, but part came from something more personal. The understanding that healing, in both people and animals, cannot be rushed. One evening, Raymond sat by the wood stove reading an old paperback. Sable lounged near the hearth, occasionally glancing toward the couch where Indigo hid. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a warm glow. After a while, Raymond sensed movement. A hesitant paw emerged, then another. Indigo stepped out, slow, cautious, eyes wide. He paused halfway into the room, unsure of his surroundings. His ribs were still visible, but his coat looked slightly fuller, signs that his body was beginning to respond to care. Raymond didn't speak. He didn't shift. He simply watched. Sable rose, walked to Indigo, and touched her nose to his forehead, a gesture gentle enough to feel like a story. Then she led him to her favorite spot near the stove. Indigo lowered himself onto the rug, the heat easing the tension in his small frame. Raymond felt something lift inside him. Not joy, exactly, something steadier, something that felt like hope. In life, progress often reveals itself in moments so subtle we nearly miss them. A step into the open, a breath taken without fear, a glance that holds just a second longer than before. Indigo's steps were small, but they carried the weight of everything he had survived. Raymond recognized those steps because he had taken them too, in his own way. After Margaret's passing, every day had felt like stepping out from behind some internal couch, fearful, unsure, wondering if it was safe to exist in the world again. Watching Indigo begin to trust was like watching a younger version of his own heart relearn its shape. Grief softens when mirrored in another living being, especially one carrying its own scars. We often think healing comes from being helped, but sometimes healing begins when we help someone else, when our care becomes a bridge that reminds us of who we once were. For Raymond, caring for Indigo and Sable pulled him back into purpose, back into participation, back into the quiet, everyday work of choosing love instead of withdrawal. Animals don't bring solutions. They bring presence, and presence is often the first step toward mending. As spring deepened, the three of them formed a ritual without intending to. Every dawn, Raymond would open the front door and step onto the porch with his mug of coffee. The sky would bloom with color, soft pink at first, then a wash of gold spreading across the valley. The creek behind the house sparkled with morning light, carrying the sound of rushing water that winter had kept quiet. Sable always emerged first, moving with a queen's steady grace. She'd settle on the right side of the porch, tail curled neatly around her paws. She watched the world with a calm that felt older than the cabin itself. Indigo came next, slower but more confident day by day. He would sit close to Sable at first, mirroring her posture, as if learning how to exist without fear. Over time, he inched a little farther forward, until he eventually claimed his own small patch of porch between Sable and Raymond, as though finding a place in the middle of the life forming there. The three of them watched the sun rise together. No words, no noise, just breath, light, and belonging. It became the favorite moment of Raymond's day, a reminder that life, no matter how fractured, still offered quiet rituals that made everything feel connected. Raymond realized that the dawn ritual wasn't just about the three of them facing the morning. It was about renewal, about the gift of another day, about the loyalty that forms when beings show up for each other consistently, a kind of love Not sentimental or dramatic, but patient and steady. The sort that grows over time until one day you look around and realize the walls of your life are warmer than they used to be. Nature teaches through patterns, through cycles, through repetition. The porch ritual became a mirror for the truth Raymond had avoided. Healing isn't a single moment. It's a rhythm. Some days are bright, some days dim. Some days are full of courage, others are full of hesitation. But each day still begins. And when you rise with others beside you, whether human or bobcat, the rising feels different, easier, less lonely. Raymond's granddaughter, Emily, visited one Saturday, camera in hand. She had been skeptical of this entire situation, worried about her grandfather, uncertain about wild animals inside a home. But when she stepped onto the porch at dawn and saw the three of them sitting in silence, she lowered her camera slowly. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Grandpa, I've never seen you look so peaceful." Raymond didn't know how to explain it, so he simply nodded. Sable glanced at Emily briefly, then returned her gaze to the valley. Indigo did the same, his small body pressed into the morning light. Emily snapped a single photo, a portrait of quiet companionship. A moment captured that felt like it belonged to a collection of heartwarming stories passed down between generations. As weeks turned into months, Indigo grew stronger, Sable grew gentler, and Raymond found himself adjusting to a life he never expected to live. One shaped not by loss, but by the unexpected loyalty of two wild creatures who had chosen him. And yet, as the year continued its slow turning, a deeper realization waited for him, one that would arrive with the soft weight of time and the knowledge that even the most beautiful moments do not stand still. If you've ever felt your life shift because of small, quiet rituals, you'll want to see how their story reaches its final, tender turning point. Some endings arrive quietly, not with a final note, but with a long, steady breath, one that tells you a chapter is closed, even as life continues unfolding its gentle pages. In the seasons that followed, as the Montana Valley slipped from spring to summer and then toward another winter, Raymond discovered that the greatest life changes often come not through dramatic moments, but through small miracles that choose to stay. With time, the cabin settled into a new rhythm. Indigo grew into his strength, moving with the confidence of a young bobcat finally certain he was safe. His coat filled in, his posture lifted, and the shadows in his gaze began to fade. Sable, once the dramatic queen of the cabin, softened into a quieter presence, not losing her flair for theatrics, just offering them more selectively. Like an artist who knew her audience well enough to save her best performances for the moments that mattered. Every day felt shaped by simple rituals that held more meaning than either animal or human could speak aloud. In the mornings, the three still gathered on the porch. In the evenings, Raymond played the harmonica gently by the fire, and sometimes, only sometimes, Sable let out a long, melodic howl that Indigo tried to copy. It wasn't music in the traditional sense, but it felt like it. A mix of mismatched notes and low tones that carried a sense of belonging across the quiet cabin. Wild animals rarely form what we might call family, but they do form bonds, complex, honest, instinctive connections rooted in shared space, shared safety, and shared trust. Bobcats are solitary by nature. Yet, when circumstances place them in an environment of stability and routine, they can build relationships that function almost like kinship. It isn't domestic affection. It's something sturdier, something shaped by coexistence rather than dependency. And that's the beauty of it. Loyalty that chooses itself every day. Ray learned to read the emotional landscape of his home with the same care he once used to read the mountains. He noticed how Sable stepped aside so Indigo could claim the sunniest spots. How Indigo sometimes watched Raymond with quiet admiration. How the cabin's air felt fuller, warmer, as if gratitude itself lived between the walls. For a man who once thought his life had narrowed to a single thread, this was an unexpected expansion. A return to something deeper. One late summer night, Raymond woke to a sound, a soft shuffle, light and hesitant. He opened his eyes to see Sable lying at the foot of his bed.
She had done that before, on rare nights when storms rolled through or when she seemed to sense something in him that he wasn't saying aloud.
But this time, Indigo lay beside her, his body resting gently against hers. For a few long moments, the room was still. Only their breathing filled the dark.
Raymond watched them in the faint glow of the moonlight.
Two wild creatures. One scarred by a past he never spoke of, the other softened by trust she had learned to give carefully. And both of them are choosing this room, choosing this night, choosing him.
He felt a warmth rise in his chest, not loud, not sudden, more like the steady glow of embers beneath ash. A feeling he had once thought grief had taken away forever.
Love, in its quiet forms, had found its way back.
Life often teaches us that we should expect
The big moments, the sweeping gestures, the grand reveals, the dramatic turning points. But healing rarely looks that way. It looks like soft mornings, shared silences, steady routines. It looks like a bobcat resting near your bed because she trusts you. It looks like another bobcat is placing himself beside her because he trusts her. It looks like kindness that grows in the spaces where no one is watching. These moments remind us that moral stories don't always begin with heroes or end with lessons spelled out neatly. Sometimes they look like the way a creature's breathing evens out when it knows it has found safety. Sometimes they look like the way grief loosens its grip, one breath at a time. For Raymond, the miracle wasn't that Sable and Indigo arrived. The miracle was that they stayed, and that staying brought him back to himself. We like to imagine that the bonds between humans and animals are simple, but the truth is, they ask us to look inward. They reveal who we've been avoiding becoming. They ask us to slow down, to open our hands again, to offer kindness even when we feel emptied. And they give something back, not in words, not in promises, but in presence. Healing presence, loyal presence, soulful presence. In that way, Sable and Indigo were more than part of an inspirational story or a heartwarming tale. They were small reminders of love that doesn't need to be earned, of loyalty that isn't loud, of happiness that arrives in unexpected shapes, quiet, steady, wild. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The forest surrounding the cabin followed its ancient rhythms, and Raymond, walking the familiar path from porch to creek each morning, carried a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He often glanced back to see Sable following at her leisurely pace, Indigo bounding behind her with youthful energy. It wasn't fantasy or fairy tales, it was simply life. A life remade by small miracles. Even on difficult days, when the world's weight pressed on him or his joints ached with the stubbornness of age, the sight of two bobcats waiting on the porch brought him back into himself, reminded him that he was still part of something living, something meaningful, something that felt blessed in the quietest, truest way. In the end, the cabin did not become a sanctuary because it was built to be one. It became a sanctuary because three hearts, one grieving, one brave, one afraid, found each other and decided to share the same mornings, the same evenings, the same gentle stretch of time. That was the miracle. Not the dramatic moments, not the challenges, but the staying, the choosing, the love that grew between them in unspoken ways. A home isn't always made of wood and stone. Sometimes it's made of trust. Sometimes it's made of routines that anchor you. Sometimes it's made of the simple knowledge that you are no longer walking through the seasons alone. And if you stood on that porch at dawn, if you saw the three of them watching the sun lift over the mountains, you would see it too. A home held together by small miracles. Before you go, take a moment, just a breath, to think about the quiet places in your own life, the ones where small miracles may already be growing. If this story touched something in you, please tap the like button so it reaches others who might need gentleness today. And if you'd like more stories that honor the bond between people and wildlife, I invite you to subscribe
and stay with us.
If you feel moved to go one step further, a warm super thanks or small donation helps support real rescue efforts for wild animals like bobcats, helping them heal,
Help them live, and helping more stories like this one take shape. Your kindness makes a difference.